Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Digital Capital Advisors Fireside Chat Series. We're excited to have you here as always. For those of you that don't know, I'm Andrew Daniel, Managing Director here on the team at DCA. DCA is a global technology investment bank. We've got offices in New York, Berlin, Tel Aviv, and San Francisco. And this show is part of our 10-year anniversary celebration, which we celebrated back in September. The Fireside Chat Series is really designed to kind of bring to light hour-long conversations with world-class technology companies and their founders and operators that we really enjoy in the e-commerce marketplace and other marketplaces as well. Today, we have Johannis, who is the founder and CEO of Productsup. We're very excited to have him, and welcome to the show.
Thanks, Andrew, for the nice introduction. Happy to be here and looking forward to our discussion and conversation.
Awesome. Well, why don't we get started ultimately in the overview of Productsup and maybe tell people a little bit what it is you guys do. I think it'd be great to hear about the story and the evolution of the business and maybe some of the capabilities that you guys have today.
Yeah, certainly, I will do that. So Productsup is a software as a service company, primarily helping retailers and e-commerce brands to distribute and optimize their product data for a variety of marketing channels, right? So the company was founded 10 years ago by Kai, my technical co-founder, and myself. And we basically, back at that point of time, struggled with optimizing our product information that we had in our own online shops and optimizing it for the requirements of the different channels, right? So basically, the way I always like to describe it is, if you look at the e-commerce world, and that is even more true nowadays than it was 10 years ago, and you're, let's say, you're a brand like IKEA and you want to advertise for your products in all the different channels, like looking at Facebook, looking at Google, looking at Twitter, looking at Instagram. If you look at the requirements of those channels, basically, they're all different, right? And you cannot take one data set and send it to all the channels and then basically get really good results on the marketing that you do. And Productsup is the piece in the middle that connects to your ERP system, to your shop system, takes your product information out of there and automatically optimizes it for the requirements of the individual channels so that you can see superior results for your ads within the different channels.
Sure. No, I think that's great. And so why don't we start maybe talking a little bit about the evolution of commerce? Because I think there's been a very significant evolution as time has gone by. I would love to get your thought on kind of how commerce has evolved, ultimately how it's turned towards e-commerce, and then maybe some of the problems that have emerged relative to that transition.
Yeah, I think, I mean, when you think about commerce, right, and e-commerce, I think the word that you hear, I don't know since how many years, is multi-channel retail, right? So I think a lot of people think about, hey, I'm a brand or I'm a retailer, and I have a product in front of me that I want to sell to my customers, right? And I think the main challenge that people have out there is to provide the customers with a unified experience around that product independently of the channel that you look at it, right? So I think you as a customer, if you decide to buy, let's say, a new pair of running shoes, right? You want to have kind of the same experience independently on which channel you look at the product. So you want to have superior information if you look at it online. You want to have good information if you go into a shop and you ask basically the salesperson there about the product. And I think that is really the challenge of brands and retailers as of today. To really get the same information independently of the channel towards a potential consumer or towards a potential buyer, right? And optimize that. I think that information also specifically to the requirements of that consumer. And I think that is the point where a lot of people are not there yet at the moment, but we believe at Productsup, this is the next step that will follow, right? So I think if you look at it nowadays, the majority of the brands and retailers, they are active on all the channels, right? You could argue how good the quality is across the different channels in terms of delivering that unified experience for a specific product. But let's imagine we are there and everybody managed to do that, and you look at the at a product and you get all the same information and high quality information independently of the channel, you're able to deliver that as a brand or a retailer. Then from our point of view, the next step in evolution is basically adjusting that information towards the specific requirements of the individual that buys, right? To give you an example, when, let's say, you think about skincare products, right? And one consumer, they might be focusing, let's say, on price. The other consumer, they might focus on basically how skin friendly is it, or how environmental friendly is it. And I think that will be the next step, which also we are at Productsup are currently working on, to enable our clients not only to adjust the information towards the specifications of the individual channel, but also then learn more about the consumer and adapt the information that you present to somebody based on the, let's say, individual preferences, right? And I think, yeah, that's probably the next step in terms of evolution when you look at commerce and e-commerce from our point of view. And of course, at the same time, I mean, if you're active in that environment, you're basically fighting with a lot of daily challenges, right? So it's a lot of new channels popping up. So if you look at the landscape 5 years ago, it was maybe a handful of channels. And now a lot of retailers, they turn into marketplaces themselves. Not a lot of new marketplaces pop up. You have a lot of social channels, which are where you now can start to sell directly. So I think the ecosystem in itself, if you're a brand or a retailer, becomes more and more complex, right? And the speed of change is also increasing. So I think we always refer there to Darwin's law, right? So not the most beautiful wins, not the most intelligent wins, but I think it holds true that the most adaptable wins, and you need to be fast in adapting, right?
I think there's a lot there to unpack, and I want to leave some of it for a little bit. So we talked a little bit about consumer expectation, talked a little bit about what's to come, but let's put that to aside for a second. You know, I think what's really profound to us at DCA, and I think you've mentioned some of these things, you know, it's the complexity and acceleration of the problem that's existing here now, and really e-commerce. It's really becoming kind of astronomical to a point where they can't keep up, right? And as I think about the evolution of the spectrum, on one side, depending on how far back you want to go, use something as simple as kind of a big box retailer, or if you go even further back, you know, literally by mail big box retailer. And on the other side, maybe you have, you know, a cutting edge, direct consumer, digital native brand who's only ever existed in the e-commerce lifespan. And for me, that spectrum is a pretty broad one where, you know, a retailer often is significant laggard on the e-commerce side, doesn't have the capability, a large volume of their sales are not happening across digital channels. When they do have e-commerce, it's typically market dependent. Somebody like an Amazon, for example, to plug into an Amazon and try to fuel there, or they're on their own destination site. But the complexity of number of channels they're distributing is relatively limited. And so that's kind of the one side. And on the other, you've got these digital native brands who are literally thinking about, can we just continue to grow the number of channels and complexity of distribution that we have? And if you think about where people exist along that spectrum, the problems vary pretty significantly. What is happening, though, is definitely a shift towards those kind of my pinnacle in this case of this native direct consumer brand, where folks are being forced to ultimately push in that direction. And when you get there and you think about the complexity of the problem, many things are happening at the same time, right? One is the number of distribution channels that are meaningful, that can generate genuine revenue to justify the use of the channel, is growing very rapidly. And those channels are getting bigger and bigger as a percentage, which means that you see a fragmentation if you look at somebody's revenue as to where they're sourcing their revenue from, right? It's not just from their own destination site, although typically the concentration exists there depending on how the business is selling, but it's happening in other places as well. Geographically, because of a lot of the logistics stuff that's been put in place and where consumers are existing today, geographically, you're seeing this geographic agnosticism that's happening for the brands to say, we'll sell anywhere and anywhere. But that means that there is linguistic challenges, there's presentation challenges, a lot of this exists. And then finally, I think for the most part, the product catalogs for the folks that are larger are getting bigger themselves as well, right? As folks get better at producing, those catalogs are widening. So all of a sudden you have a lot of different things that are going to create this really large challenge where the brands, regardless of size, regardless of what they're doing or how complex their setup is, they are needing to solve this issue of how do we get our products to look the way we want them to look, sound the way we want them to sound, be genuinely really high quality, and be distributed across all these really dynamic places in real time, right? And that is a technology needed solution. It's not something where an individual can possibly do that. And I think what's happened in this space, and part of where you guys fit in is, when this problem came about, I think brands recognized, particularly the newer kinds, very quickly, this is not a problem that we're going to be able to solve on our own, right? The time, the money, the energy to go solve that, is going to be really not worth it at the end of the day. Let's find a technology partner. I think many of the large retailers, as they move on the spectrum of complexity, are also figuring this out and saying, hey, we better go find somebody to help solve this problem. And at the end, if you look behind the curtain at a lot of these large e-commerce operations, what you're finding is it's really kind of an interlacing of many different things that are coming into place. One, of course, is how do you manage your product information and how do you distribute that into the world? Another one is how do you actually show the product on the page? How do we think about search and recommendation and all these different things? Another might be how do we understand customer data so we can effectively distribute promotions or target folks in a personalized and customized way. And this web of solutions that's building in the background, I think, is very interesting to us because that, unlike in many other sectors, that infrastructure is existing outside of the large brands for the most part, with the exception of the really large players, right? The Amazons and the Walmarts or others of the world. So again, I think that spectrum is really meaningful. Where I'm taking this is that I think COVID has done this space a significant benefit in that it took the laggards. Again, I use the laggard as, a retailer who maybe has a destination site, maybe is selling third party somewhere, but isn't terribly complex. And at some point, right, particularly around Q2, said, all of a sudden these retailers are not going to have the same retail sell-through as they did before. And so the retailers were left kind of holding the bag saying, oh my goodness, what do we do if we can't sell in our normal channels we've been doing for the last 50 or 100 years? And that forced them very rapidly to say, we better get very serious about e-commerce really quickly here. Otherwise, we are just going to run out of money, right? Our revenues are going to fall off a cliff. And so we saw kind of in Q2 that begin to happen. And then when the numbers really hit in Q3, senior folks saying, figure this out quick because we can't live like this forever. And we saw this very rapid shift on the scale where these legacy folks who historically were not prioritizing e-commerce the way they should have been, very rapidly shifted and needed to get further along the spectrum. And I think that's done a very significant benefit to the space. And I expect to continue to see that in 21 and 22. And I think that's the thankfulness that you can give to COVID, besides the fact that the volume of e-commerce and aggregate also increased, supporting a lot of the businesses that exist. So I say all that. I'd be curious to get your thoughts on, the COVID effect, how lasting is it, right? Is it a structural shift? Is it a short-term shift? And, what do you think that does to the space generally relative to that evolution?
Yeah, I think it will certainly accelerate the evolution, right? So I think that is for sure. And I think the way you described it, I think we're not in a world, or we haven't been also pre-COVID, we haven't been in a world where there were people ignoring e-commerce totally, right? I think that is something you could argue if the topic of e-commerce would have been high enough up in the priority and high enough up on the agenda, right? And I think what COVID certainly did there is putting it higher on the agenda, right? And really saying, look, that needs to be a priority for us right now. So I think what we mainly saw is that it accelerated decision-making processes for larger players, right? Where you would normally take, let's say, half a year of a sales cycle. And they turned around and, like you described, they said, hey, we need something quick right now. and you would expect them to sign something within 3-6 months time, and you got the signature within 4-8 weeks, right? So it accelerated significantly on the decision-making process, right? And I think to some extent, I always have full understanding, right? If you realize a significant part of your business with your physical retail stores, it's hard to focus on e-commerce, right? And I think to some extent, some of the, like you described, the digital natives, they have that advantage because they have that one outlet and they focus on it, and it's totally clear that's their main revenue driver, right? So I think a lot of energy shifted to the question, how can we accelerate e-commerce? And I think that is gonna stay. And I think for me personally, the ideal setup is really one where you are truly multi-channel, right? Where you have physical stores and at the same time also have the capabilities to really tailor to everybody who wants to buy online, right? So I think that is the part where I think a lot of the brands and retailers who have physical outlets need to get better is leveraging actually the power of their physical stores towards us as the consumers, right? I don't see it that necessarily the online pure player has an advantage, but if you really leverage the power of your physical stores and turn it into more of a consumer and customer experience room, like more of a showroom, right? And you make it interesting for people to go there and experience the product, I think then you have an advantage over somebody who only is able to show the images and the product online, right? So I think in total, I think the focus and the importance of e-commerce was accelerated, and I think that trend is going to continue. And ideally, right, so now people also use the time to think about how can I really make sense of my physical outlets, and once they're allowed to reopen again and everybody goes to the shops again, how can I really increase the experience that a consumer has by having those physical stores?
Yeah. And again, I use that laggard category as an extremist pole to show the two sides of things. I think what we've noticed is that, as that shift is occurring, particularly the retail folks who have significant retail presences, who perhaps are not spending as much time as they should on e-commerce, but now are spending, significantly more and have prioritized it. You're talking about what we think about, which is the unification of retail and e-commerce, right? How do you unify those two streams together? And part of it is that retail needs to improve and change in a really structural way. And so everybody agrees that you have to build a better experience. Maybe you can figure out ways to make it a more digital experience or just generally more engaging and interesting, and not just I walked into a store and walked around. But there's also a connective tissue that needs to be built there. And I think that connective tissue is really interesting. Thinking about, today, for instance, if you walk into a store and a show person shows you a jacket and you go, thanks for showing this to me, but I'm going to go buy it online. We have no way to understand the interlack of how that ultimately happened, right? The connectivity there is very bad. Our view is that the connectivity between the retail channel and then ultimately the e-commerce channel is going to be unified really significantly. That's going on to big questions they're a lot working on. But in that unification, what it comes down to is, and maybe this is the next topic, the consumer expectation has risen really significantly in time. If you just look at the kind of expectation that a consumer has, it's aggressively up and to the right. And I think this unification is part of that expectation, right? We don't want to have these legacy experiences. For us, that expectation of the consumer kind of hits home in a couple different places, depending on how you're looking at the world. So, on one side, you say, Amazon and large players have accustomed consumers to a certain quality of imagery, a certain quality of product information, a certain quality of shipping experience or checkout experience, right? And they're being used almost as a benchmark that others are trying to hold to. Direct consumer brands have also helped to set this new benchmark of where consumers should be. But to me, that plays fold into e-commerce technology in a number of ways, right? And I think you hinted on this, a couple minutes ago. One is that, we have to make sure that the quality of product that we're putting forward, from messaging, from a photo, from a language, all this kind of stuff, has to be A1, right? We just can't make any mistakes there, because we know that the result is people don't check out. You've got all these problems. They don't even add things to the cart. And so we know that that's kind of the bare minimum of what we need. The next step is, how do we understand customization and personalization across a variety of facets, right? How are we able to customize search, or how do we bundle recommendations together, or how do we make sure that we're showing the right cut of a promotion to somebody who, to your point, might care more about price or might care more about the product itself, right, and be a little bit price insensitive. So there's all these different ways I think that's happening, and that unification of customer data I think is going to occur between the retail and e-commerce world. And then maybe finally, it's also the logistics, right? It's this idea that 5 or 10 years ago it was very easy to charge $14.99 for shipping. Today you can't always get away with that, right? The consumer doesn't have a lot of tolerance towards shipping costs. And so there's many different ways. I'd be curious to get your thoughts on how do you think about, much like the evolution of the enterprise customer, how do you think about the evolution of the consumer and where those expectations are really hitting home with brands today?
Yeah, so I think I certainly agree, right, that the expectations of the consumer have risen over time, right? And I think people are purely more informed than they have been a couple of years ago,
Sure.
right? It's easier to access information. It's easier to compare. So I think basically you could expect the level of information that a, let's say, standard consumer has to be higher than a couple of years ago. And I think that is the point where you as a brand or a retailer, you have to understand that and basically take it one step further and provide additional value, right? It's not about color, price, and then that's it, right? It is really about understanding where the consumer sits and what he or she wants, right? And I think that is the task of everybody that wants to sell to somebody, right? And I think all the other factors, like having an easy return option, having it delivered quite fast, they will become a commodity over time, right? So I think the way we always looked at is we talk to our customers and we tell them, look, we want to enable you to get your product data into a position where they become a competitive advantage, right? Because let's say if you're an online shop and you sell different brands, right? And you think about, let's say, a Nike shoe, you could probably buy that Nike shoe in 200 other shops. So what is your point of differentiation, right? So if we now think that basically shipping, returns, and all that kind of stuff, that's going to become a commodity at some point, right? So then you can compete on price. If you compete on price, you destroy your own margins. So you're not going to do that for the longer period, right? And the second thing where you can really be superior to your competition is getting better and getting more tailored information towards the consumer, right? And I think that is ultimately the setup where we believe those people are going to win. And the way we think about it is, it's a little bit going into your direction, right? We think about how can we create a network and how can we kind of connect the different dots of information that exist in the current market setup. So to give you one example, right? So a Bayersdorf with the brand Nivea is one of our customers. If you now think about them, they sell, let's say, Nivea creams to Kroger's and Walgreens, which are also our customers, right? So at that point, they don't know anything about what is happening at those retailers with the products that they sell to them. They don't have information about the consumers ultimately buying them. At some point, they will get the next order, right? And I think what we want to create is a collaboration between the outlets where the people ultimately buy, getting a feedback loop to the brand itself, in that case, Bayersdorf, right? So that the two can work together and either optimize the flow of goods or get additional information when it comes to optimizing the product for specific requirements. So in the end, I think, of course, what you need in the future is a product which is tailored towards the demands of a consumer, right? And then the second thing is getting the right information in front of somebody at the point where they're ready to buy, right? Because it might be that if you're presented with one set of information, and we all know we have a short attention span, right? We look at the information and we decide for most of the goods that we purchase instantly if we're going to do it or not, right? And it might be that you would buy in a scenario A where you get presented with a certain set of information, you would buy the product, and the same product with the, let's say, the same total set of information, but you pick a different subset, you advertise that to the consumer and they say, no, I'm not going to buy that product, right? And I think that's where the intelligence sits, to understand basically the consumer and understand which kind of information do I need to show in order to convince them. So basically understanding what is important for them. And I think then you can close the loop and go back to the, let's say, the physical retail again, right? So when you think like, let's say 30, 40 years back, you would know your customers, right? And if you go into a shop, you would know, hey, Andrew, he never buys a brown suit, right? He either buys a black one or a blue one or whatever it is, right? And then the person knowing you, they would approach you with the, let's say, with an offer tailored towards you. And I think we need to create the same experience online.
And I think that's a profound challenge, right? I mean, we spent a lot of time now talking about, okay, here's what's going on. Here's the spectrum of kind of the brands. Here's the spectrum of the consumers. I think everybody agrees we're shifting to the right. But there's now a profound challenge. And e-commerce to me in general has always been a very interesting category, because unlike in other categories where you see a lot of in-housing action, that is, you see brands who take a lot of the technology in-house or build stuff themselves or generally are trying to pull it in, in e-commerce, you don't see that same level of kind of action happening. Now, some of the large players I mentioned undoubtedly have built a lot of technology in-house. Some of the direct consumer brands have built a little bit of connective tissue in-house or have built something proprietary. But in aggregate, if you look at the space, most folks are super heavily reliant on external technology providers to solve their issues, because the issues are so complex that it's just not worth them pursuing. So in thinking about all of this, and I very much agree with what you just said, I'd be curious to get your thoughts on, what are the problems that the brands have today that's at the top of their list, right? As they think about addressing these trends and up and to the right, what is their technology problem that they're looking to solve today, and where do they exist in general? I would be very curious to that. And then maybe where we'll head next is, where is this technology stack headed that needs to exist, right? How does it mature and how does it get more complex? But I'd like to start with, today, as you speak with folks that kind of boots on the ground, where are you seeing these problems for brands emerge, and where are you hearing from them as they think about their prioritized technology issues?
Yeah, I mean, of course, coming from a certain segment of the market, right? My view on that is definitely impacted by that. But of course, what we hear most often is that people struggle with the complexity, right? So it is really those new channels popping up, that new requirements that people have, that I would say more complex requirements for the existing channels, right? So when you look, for example, we always take Facebook as an example. When you look at the catalog requirements from Facebook 5 years ago, it was like 20, right? And if you now look at it, it's like 50 different categories that you have to fill out, and different subset of information that you need. So basically, it's really a subset of information that people need to deliver in order to be able to advertise for their products within the existing channels already. And then on top of that, you can add new channels and new geographies, right? So it's really that exploding complexity that leads to the fact that people can't focus on their core business, right? Which is developing a product and selling it to the end consumer, because they're caught in that action of getting it actually online, right? And that's basically where we step in and help them, right? So I think that is, from our point of view, the main challenge there, right? And I think for me, the question is, when you spoke about how heavily you rely on external technology, right? I think you have to ask yourself the question, like anybody else, right? What is my core competency? What I'm really good at? What is the thing? What is the bare reason for my existence, right? And I think it's for a brand or a retailer, it's not delivering and creating a technology which is able to distribute my product information, right? That's a necessity. That's a problem that you need to solve. So therefore, for me, it doesn't impact your competitiveness if you use an external service for that, right?
Yeah.
And I think what we have seen over time, and I think that's comparable to search engine advertising, for example, at the start where, let's say, product catalogs haven't been that complex and the requirements haven't been that complex, you would see a lot of agencies being involved, right? And I think now over time, over the last, I would say 3 to 5 years, what happened is that people did understand they really need to be in control of their product information. They need to be in control of their product data. So either they created a position for that in-house, or they over time took it back from the agencies and now handling it in a team themselves, or put it into the hands of the online marketing team. So I think you saw an increasing importance, but also people becoming more knowledgeable of the fact that product information and the product data is really, really important for them to be able to do business in the future, right? And I think the same happened with search engine advertising. At beginning, people gave it to an agency, and then they realized, oh, it's 30% of my online sales, so I'd rather take that in-house and have it in control or under control myself.
Yeah. I think we very much agree with that. Our view is that absolutely the brand should not be trying to solve this problem themselves. That's a terrible idea, and generally leads to lots of wasted effort, money, and energy. I think there's many a case study you can point to show that somebody tried to solve a problem that was not their core competency, and they wasted a lot of time and probably negatively affected their core business, just to sell stuff. So I couldn't agree more on that. For us, as we think about the technology stack, and we'll finish here in a minute with where are we headed in the more kind of broad, but on the technology stack, I think for us what's interesting is if you look at the landscape today, and we leave, that's Productsup. We just leave and go look at the macro e-commerce technology platforms. You've got a lot of relatively, I won't call them point solutions, but are doing one thing, right? They're good at one particular thing. Maybe it's managing, product information management. Maybe it's search and recommendation. Maybe it's thinking about shipping and logistics, or whatever it is, right? But you're getting these very specific verticals. And inside of those verticals, generally relatively busy. There are lots of different kinds of players that exist, and lots of small guys, right? Once you start going above 10 million ARR, the list tends to get pretty short in each of those buckets. And what's happening is the large customers are going into each of those and kind of shopping a la carte and saying, okay, I know I need to deal with my product information. I know I need to deal with my shipping and logistics. I know I need to deal with returns, and basically going down a price menu and saying, I'll pick this, I'll pick this, I'll pick this. And they're putting solutions together and sometimes trying to build that interconnected tissue I keep talking about in ways that probably those solutions weren't designed to do, right? I don't know if you guys thought that you would be perfectly intertangled with some other, search and recommendation business would be perfectly to fit with some other thing, right? So, this idea of selling together is not happening quite as much as you see in other industries. And so I think, our view as we think about the technology stack specifically is that transactionally what we're going to see is undoubtedly a consolidation vertically inside of these specific, specifications and capabilities. So we're going to see PIMs by other PIMs. We're going to see search businesses by other search businesses. What's more interesting to us, though, is that if you look at the large players across these verticals, as they continue to mature, as they get to profitability, as they get to scale, there's a very compelling argument, and we're beginning to see this already transactionally, to say, what if somebody, a strategic, private equity, et cetera, came in and started to consolidate and unify these solutions so that you are, in fact, selling a bundle, right? That all of a sudden, instead of me as a brand going to 10 different service providers and trying to cut deals and then figure out how to work it all together, I can go to one, have them offer me everything that's super high quality, and that selling motion being a lot more interesting. And so, our view is that that's happening today and is just at the beginning stages, but we'll see that unification of the tech stack occur. The other thing that we think about as part of it is, we've had a lot of CDPs, customer data platforms, on this show. It's a space that we spend a lot of time in. And I don't think we're fully convinced yet that CDP is the answer, as I frequently say on the show. It is not that the CDP is the holy grail that we're looking for. But what we do think is happening is that ultimately this unification of customer data, understanding the customer on all the interfaces, right? Not just the fact that you have a cookie of them on a website, but instead that you know where they exist, you know where they've gone into your store, you understand location, you understand a lot of this interlacking. And some of it is reporting by actual firms and doing the measurement, other of it is technology enabled. But if you have that as a base, then for us, this unified technology stack on the back end becomes very compelling to merge with some kind of data customer understanding, so you can understand the customer. And when you put those two things together, then you're talking about, wow, where are we headed, right? And that's when you get the ability to really do customization and personalization. And I say all that in the idea that, today, the only example we really have of that, are these large walled garden e-commerce platforms who've done some of this action on their own, right? Amazon is the easiest one to point to, but you can point to others as well, who get customer data organically through their site, are relatively restricted because none of them really have retail presences with any real scale, and have built the technology themselves because, in their case, technology is their core business. And so you get that action happening. It's been very successful. But outside of those walled gardens, there's no great examples of that today. And as we think about the technology evolution of where we're headed, that's what's interesting to us technology-wise. So I don't know how you feel about that, but that to us is kind of the broader view on how we think about the technology evolution.
Yeah, so I think, that's a discussion that you a lot of the times have, right? Best of breed, or is it a platform, right? And our belief is that over the next couple of years, of course, I also don't have a crystal ball, but I think what will happen, at least in our space, is there will be a system of record for product information, right? So it simply doesn't make sense for somebody to, like you described, go into the menu and shop from different providers. And I think a lot of people already in the industry, they're starting to position themselves for building that platform, right? And I think if you would ask me, you described it quite well in a way that there are a lot of different solutions, but if you then look at some players which have a certain scale, there are not that many. There may be a handful, maybe two handful, right? And I think then the next question that you have to ask yourself, what is really, let's say, multi-tenant, pure cloud, software as a service solution? Then it is even less, right? And I think you can create that great system of record if you combine the best of breed, pure SaaS, multi-tenant software solutions. And then you need to do the job of having a proper integration between the different systems, right? So it's really like, you could go back to the start of our conversation when we talked about multi-channel, right? There it's multi-product, and in the end, it comes down to delivering then a unified experience over the different products that you just combined in one platform. But I have no doubt that this will happen over time, right? Because it just makes sense for the buyer. They don't want to buy a PIM and then a syndication solution and then an analytics or business intelligence solution on top. They want to have it as one solution.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, let me ask now a big question, which is we've talked about where we've gotten to today. We've talked about the evolution of technology. We've talked about all this kind of stuff. I'll give you our view on where, at least at a high level, e-commerce is headed, and maybe you'll go more macro. And then I'd be very curious to get yours, probably a better view than me. But here's how we think about it. So ultimately, one thing we've talked a lot about is we think about the spectrum. On the retail side, we expect this really significant unification between retail and e-commerce. We talked about it a lot on this chat. For us, that's a certain future driver. We're going to see the unification of those two things happen. We think that the retail environment will shift radically, particularly for the leaders. It'll lag, this will take time, but ultimately you'll end up with a very engaging, interactive retail experience that understands the customer in a variety of ways is able to link that to an e-commerce experience and create a very linear experience for the consumer. So on that side of the equation, we expect to see that. In the middle, we expect to see a significant adoption of a few things. One is a much more personalized and customized experience in an e-commerce or even in a retail setting. But in e-commerce, it's most obvious to point to. When folks get to a website, their identity is understood, their preferences are understood. How that's happening still hasn't emerged, but we're getting there. And we'll be able to deliver very customized and personalized experiences. And that really means that, A, I can understand what it is you're looking for and why. B, I can make recommendations based on previous histories of what it is you may like and what you won't like. I can more complexly make bundled recommendations that's similar to Amazon is doing today, where I can say this combination of things is probably interesting to you. I can tweak the language of how products are being displayed or shown based on what I know has a greater uplift for your kind of audience base. And finally, I can understand shipping, logistics, where I can add additional margin, where I can't, pending that consumer tolerance to those kinds of things, right? So I'm talking about a pretty complex level of personalization and customization, a significant amount of retargeting capability, understanding outside of just the site, when I should poke somebody, when they're naturally getting to their buyer cycle where they're going to buy again, what kind of things they're going to respond to. So again, this is a real holy grail, and this to me is the middle of the path relative to the spectrum. All the way over to the right, I think the direct consumers are the most forefront with regards to pushing the limits, if you will, of where this can go. I completely agree that forever we're going to see this endless growth of number of channels. I don't think we're ever going to get to a top where we say, oh no, it's just too many channels. For me, this only increases and increases and increases. But I think the complexity and the kinds of channels is going to shift quite profoundly. I think something that we've seen in Asia is using interactive content experiences, so live streams, videos, etc., to engage the consumer and really force buying activity. Of course, this comes from the legacy days, though it still exists today, believe it or not, of a nice lady getting on a show and saying, hey, please buy this, and people literally calling in to buy, right? And that shockingly still happens today. But to me, that 21st century version is going to be a lot of this live stream activity, marrying what we're seeing in different categories like gaming and other places, and figuring out ways to make it more entertaining and engaging relative to that broadening of the number of distribution channels. We also expect that the product iterations themselves for those direct consumer brands is going to be completely changed with regards to how they actually decide the products they're going to create. We've seen a number of media businesses, a good friend of mine, Barack, Imagine, for example, looking at the trends of what's going on in the marketplace, the trends of what the consumer wants, predicting what that might mean in the future, and then building products accordingly. So we think that structurally that's going to change. And then finally, we think that everything I talked about in the middle, as kind of the middle road of customization and personalization, will be taken one tier even further and done in a really interesting and sophisticated way to ultimately support that kind of cutting edge limit. So that's our view on where we're headed in e-commerce, and that's all backlit by, we think structurally COVID has accelerated e-commerce. We think it was always there. There was never a time where somebody ignored it. Simply that the priority has now risen really significantly, and that consumers have been conditioned even further to say that I am purchase place agnostic. I need to understand price. I want to understand the transparency. And it's a heck of a lot easier for me to go on a site and get something delivered to me next day than it is for me to go into a store and buy stuff. And we think that's only going to accelerate in the out years. So again, that was a lot, but that as we think about the spectrum is kind of where we think e-commerce is headed. Would be very curious to get your views on where you think e-commerce is headed and how you think about the world.
Yeah, I think to a large extent, I would agree, right? So I think when you look at, let's say, a broader spectrum of years, I think 10, 20 years back, somebody would create a product, put it in front of the consumer and say, here's the product, do you want to buy it or not, right? Yeah. And I think to the extent where it is economical and where it's feasible, the design process for the product is going to be an individual one, right? So when I think about it, I saw a couple of examples, right? For example, where people individualize the face cream depending on the skin that you have. That totally makes sense, and that is feasible, right? So I think on that side of the spectrum, the product will adapt to the requirements of the consumer, right? That's the direct to consumer brands that you described, right? And I think in the middle, in the middle segment there, when you can't adapt the product, right, it's adapting the information that you're going to present to somebody, right? It's that idea that I described earlier. We want to enable our customers to basically be able to put in front the right information regarding a specific product to the individual which is just looking at the product, and they would do that as an, let's say, a unified experience over all the channels, right? So I think it's adapting, making the product more personal, and if you can't personalize the product, making the information that you're going to present to a consumer more personal. And I think it's about the relevant information, right? So I think when you look at a couple of 100 years back, there was scarcity of information. Now we have an overflow of information, and we are all really grateful if somebody presents the right information to us, right? So I think the shorter the emails are that we get, the happier we are if they contain the right information. And I think the same holds true for product information. You want to get the right information which is relevant for you delivered in the channel that you are on, right, that you are using. And I think that's where we're basically heading, right? So we're going to make it as easy as possible for a consumer to buy a product, and that product should be as much customized to the individual requirements as possible.
Yeah. No, I couldn't agree more. Well, look, this has been a very interesting conversation, and again, really glad that you could join us. So thank you very much, and I think we'll leave it there. But this has been super helpful. So thanks again.
Thank you, Andrew, for having me.
Awesome.